By January 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing, yet it refused to die quietly. From the Baltic to the Balkans, the Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. What had once been Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year empire was now a continent-spanning ruin of burning cities and broken armies. In the east, the Red Army had shattered the Vistula line and was driving westward in an unstoppable tide, its armored columns racing toward Berlin through the snow-choked plains of Poland. Yet far to the south, across the frozen fields and villages of Hungary, the last elite formations of the Waffen-SS were gathering their strength for one final, desperate stand. It would be a campaign fought not for victory, but for loyalty, pride, and delusion, an echo of a war already lost. The Germans called it Unternehmen für Verlängerwaken, Operation Spring Awakening, their last great offensive of the war. History would remember it as the death ride of the SS, the final, futile charge of a dying regime. The stage was set along the icy banks of the Danube, where the snows of February still blanketed the countryside. The Soviet capture of Budapest had shattered the final Axis foothold in Hungary. Once a magnificent European capital, Budapest was now a desolate wasteland, its grand boulevards reduced to rubble, its bridges lying twisted in the river, and its defenders wiped out almost to the last man. Entire German and Hungarian divisions had been annihilated in its defense. The fall of the city enraged Hitler beyond measure. He refused to accept that Hungary, with its vital oil fields and central position, was lost forever. Those oil fields near Lake Balaton, the Reich's last functioning petroleum reserves, were the lifeblood of his war machine. Without them, Germany's tanks, trucks, and aircraft would grind to a halt. And so, in one final act of denial, Hitler chose not to defend, but to attack. His response was as irrational as it was catastrophic. He ordered his most elite formation, the 6th SS Panzer Army, veterans of the Normandy Campaign and the Battle of the Bulge, to move south to Hungary and launch a counter-offensive against the Red Army. In Hitler's mind, these men represented the unbreakable will of National Socialism, soldiers of pure ideology who could defy logic, defy fatigue, and somehow turn the tide of war through sheer fanaticism. Among them were the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlergen divisions, already bloodied and battered, their numbers depleted, their tanks worn out, and their fuel dangerously low. Yet despite their condition, they remained feared by their enemies and revered by their Führer. Under the direction of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, a plan was hastily drawn up for a three-pronged assault. To begin on March 6, 1945, the 6th SS Panzer Army, under the command of General Sepp Dietrich, would strike north from the region around Lake Balaton toward Székesfehérvár RVBR, then drive to the Danube to encircle Soviet forces positioned south of Budapest. Simultaneously, the 2nd Panzer Army would push forward from the Drava River, while Army Group South under General Otto Weiler would hold the Central Front and tie down Soviet reserves. It was an ambitious, almost fantastical plan, an offensive dreamed up by men still clinging to illusions of control. Hitler convinced himself that, if successful, the operation might reverse the situation, entirely retaking Budapest, safeguarding the Balaton oil fields, and perhaps even delaying the Soviet advance on Vienna. But in truth, the offensive was doomed before it began. Soviet intelligence had already detected the German troop movements. Aerial reconnaissance revealed fresh tank concentrations near the lakes, while partisan reports confirmed the arrival of SS divisions by rail. Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin, commander of the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front, prepared accordingly. His forces built multiple defensive belts lined with anti-tank guns, minefields, and artillery positions concealed among frozen forests and ridgelines. Behind these waited armored reserves of T-34s and Heavy IS-2 tanks, supported by veteran Guards mechanized units, battle-hardened soldiers who had already fought across Poland, Romania, and the Balkans. Still, the Germans believed they could achieve surprise. On the fog-shrouded morning of March 6, 1945, the final offensive of the Third Reich began. Under a gray sky and freezing mist, more than 400 German tanks and assault guns roared to life, their engines echoing through the Hungarian countryside. The ground shook as artillery opened up, thousands of shells raining down on Soviet lines, shattering trees and sending plumes of frozen earth into the air. Villages like Srvbz and Stulweisenberg trembled under the bombardment, their church steeples collapsing as shockwaves rippled through the valley. Then came the armor. Columns of panthers, tigers, and jagdpanthers surged forward, treads grinding through the snow and ice, exhaust fumes billowing behind them. Infantry clung to the sides of the tanks, their white camouflage blending into the winter haze. At first, the offensive appeared to succeed. The Leibstandarte spearheaded the assault, punching through Soviet outposts near Lake Balaton and capturing several villages in quick succession. By the end of the first day, they had advanced nearly 15 kilometers, an impressive feat under such brutal conditions. To the west, Das Reich and Hitlerjugend fought with equal determination, overrunning isolated pockets of Soviet resistance and taking prisoners along the frozen canals. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed as if the SS had rekindled the fire of their old invincibility, one last spark of the terrifying efficiency that had once conquered Europe. The initial days of the offensive seemed to recapture the lost magic of Blitzkrieg. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though the ghosts of 1940 had returned. German officers reported a surge of morale, describing their men as fighting with the old fire. Panther and Tiger crews charged forward through sheets of snow and smoke, their confidence renewed by the sight of villages burning ahead of them. Goebbels' propaganda ministry quickly seized on the momentum, broadcasting triumphant bulletins that spoke of a miraculous rebirth of German arms. Newsreels in Berlin showed smiling SS tank crews beside their massive machines, as if victory itself had returned to bless the Reich one last time. But the illusion could not last. Within 48 hours, the offensive began to unravel. The early arrival of the spring thaw, the dreaded Rasputitsa, turned the Hungarian plains into a vast, sucking morass. What had been frozen fields just days before melted into endless seas of mud. Tanks that had thundered forward with confidence now bogged down in knee-deep sludge, their treads spinning uselessly. Trucks sank to their axles, supply wagons overturned, and even the powerful half-tracks of the SS struggled to move. Exhausted soldiers waded through the muck with rifles held above their heads, their boots torn off by the sticky clay. Soviet artillery observers, stationed on the low ridges overlooking the plain, watched it all unfold. With cold precision, they radioed in coordinates for devastating barrages that blanketed the German positions in fire and shrapnel, churning the earth into an even deeper quagmire. What had begun as a fast-moving armored thrust soon degenerated into a miserable crawl, and then, inevitably, came the counterfire, from camouflaged positions concealed behind frozen hedgerows. Soviet anti-tank gunners unleashed lethal volleys of armor-piercing rounds. Their shells slammed into the German vanguard at terrifyingly close range, tearing through panthers and tigers alike. One by one, the armored spearheads of the 6th SS Panzer Army were picked apart. Soviet infantry, entrenched and supported by self-propelled guns, fought for every ridge and hamlet with unyielding ferocity. In places like Sis and Serig-Lys, German units fought for hours to capture a single farmhouse, only to lose it again by nightfall. Still, the Leibstandarte pressed on, finally capturing Reshent Gotha on March 8 after brutal house-to-house combat. Their triumph was short-lived. Within hours, Soviet counterattack struck back with overwhelming force, driving the exhausted SS men out of the ruins they had bled to take. By now, the offensive had lost all momentum. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, knew the situation was hopeless. His men were running out of fuel, ammunition, and even food, yet the orders from Berlin remained unchanged. Hitler, isolated in his bunker and blinded by delusion, refused to allow any withdrawal. To him, the SS divisions were more than soldiers, they were living symbols of his ideology, and symbols could not retreat. He demanded that the attack continue to the last drop of blood, believing that failure would be a personal betrayal. Dietrich, a veteran of countless campaigns, could only obey and watch as his once proud army bled itself white in the Hungarian mud. By mid-March, the spearheads of the German advance had gained less than 30 kilometers, at a cost that defied comprehension. Then the full might of the Red Army came crashing down. Reinforcements from the 5th Guards Army and the 6th Guards Tank Army entered the battle, launching a massive counter-offensive that would obliterate what remained of Operation Spring Awakening. Under a deafening artillery barrage that lasted for hours, waves of T-34s and his 2 heavy tanks surged forward. The villages of Enying, Simontornia, and Aba were transformed into infernos of fire and smoke. Soviet aircraft Yak-9 fighters and Ilyushin Il-2 ground attack planes swept low over the battlefield, strafing the clogged roads and igniting fuel trucks with rockets and cannon shells. Entire German tank battalions burned where they stood. Radio intercepts from the front crackled with despair of ammunition, engines failing, enemy tanks all around us. No way out. The battlefield had become a nightmare. German tanks slipped helplessly in the muck, their treads jammed with wet clay. Crews bailed out under fire, only to be cut down by Soviet machine guns. Infantrymen huddled in ditches and shell holes, firing Panzerfausts at advancing Soviet armor until the tanks rolled over them, crushing men and trenches alike beneath tons of steel. Whole formations simply disappeared, swallowed by mud, fire, and confusion. The mighty Tiger II tanks of the Leibstandarte 70-ton beasts of steel sank so deep into the marshy ground that crews were forced to abandon them, their enormous guns pointing uselessly at the sky. Moments later, Soviet gunners finished them off with well-aimed shots. By March 15th, Operation Spring Awakening had completely collapsed. Marshal Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front struck with full force, driving deep into the German flanks. The SS divisions, exhausted and outnumbered, could do little more than fall back in disarray. Soviet tank columns now rolled triumphantly over the same ground the Germans had fought so bitterly to capture days earlier. What had begun as Hitler's final gamble turned into a disastrous rout, one that broke the last offensive strength of the Waffen-SS forever. The retreat was chaos incarnate. Command networks disintegrated. Radios went silent. Officers vanished or were killed trying to rally their men. The roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles, burned-out tanks, and panicked columns of retreating troops. Soviet air power ruled the skies. From dawn until dusk, squadrons of Yak-9s and Il-2 Sturmoviks hunted the withdrawing Germans, strafing them mercilessly. The same frozen lakes and bogs that had hindered the advance now became death traps for the retreat. Dozens of German tanks broke through the thinning ice of Lake Balaton and vanished beneath, their crews sealed inside as the freezing water poured in the midst of the catastrophe. Hitler's fury erupted. On March 19th, he issued one of his most infamous orders, accusing Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army of cowardice and betrayal. He declared that the SS had failed him and commanded that all its men remove their cuff titles, the embroidered bands that bore the name Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. For the veterans who had fought since Poland and France, it was an insult beyond comprehension, humiliation worse than defeat. In the shattered villages of Western Hungary, men who had once been hailed as the elite of the Reich now tore the insignia from their sleeves in silence, standing amid the ruins of their own myth. Dietrich himself reportedly ignored Hitler's furious command, muttering bitterly that his men had bled enough to turn their insignia 100 times over. His quiet defiance spoke volumes. The once proud Leibstandarte was broken, its veterans exhausted, its tanks wrecked, its faith in victory gone. As the shattered German forces fell back across the Hungarian countryside, the Soviets pressed their advantage with merciless precision. The 3rd Ukrainian Front surged westward, capturing the vital city of Szczecin RVBR and pushing relentlessly toward Vienna. What remained of the Waffen-SS divisions fought on with grim determination, conducting desperate rearguard actions. They blew up bridges behind them, mined crossroads, and turned every village into a fortress, fighting to the last man to delay the Soviet tide. Yet every hour of resistance came at a terrible cost. Soviet artillery pounded them without rest, and the once disciplined German columns dissolved into chaos. By the final week of March, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Red Army had broken through the last defensive lines and crossed into Austrian territory. For the Germans, Hungary had become a graveyard. The Leibstandarte and Das Reich divisions were now mere shadows of their former selves, units that had once crushed armies reduced to scattered platoons clinging to survival. Their armored strength, once counted in hundreds of tanks, had dwindled to only a handful of functioning vehicles. Around Vesper M, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was encircled and almost annihilated. Entire battalions were erased in the mud south of Lake Balaton, their burned-out tanks forming grim tombs for their crews. The Waffen-SS, once the pride of Hitler's Reich, paraded as the embodiment of Aryan strength, was dying not in triumph, but in filth, exhaustion, and despair. The final act came in early April. Soviet forces, spearheaded by Marshal Tolbuchin's mechanized corps, surged toward Vienna in a rolling tide of armor and artillery. Against them stood the crumbling remnants of the SS and Wehrmacht men who had nothing left but their rifles and a stubborn will to delay the inevitable. The German defense collapsed under the sheer weight of Soviet firepower. The thunder of Katyusha rockets and the roar of T-34 engines filled the air as entire blocks of the Austrian capital were reduced to rubble. In the narrow streets of Vienna, those same SS veterans who had launched Operation Verhalungerwaken only weeks earlier now fought not for victory, but for survival. The battle raged from house to house, cellar to cellar, until the red banners rose above the ruined spires. Vienna fell on April 13th. The cost of the campaign was staggering. German losses during the offensive and the ensuing Soviet counterattack exceeded 40,000 men, along with hundreds of irreplaceable tanks, assault guns, and artillery pieces. The elite divisions that Hitler had once trusted above all others were shattered beyond repair. Soviet casualties were heavy as well, around 30,000 killed and wounded, but they could absorb such losses. For the Reich, there was nothing left to give. The offensive had consumed the last drops of fuel, the final reserves of armor, and the fading illusion that victory was still possible. What remained was only exhaustion and ruin. In the years that followed, historians would endlessly debate why Hitler had chosen to launch such a futile attack. Some argued that he truly believed his Waffen-SS divisions, driven by ideological zeal and blind loyalty, could accomplish what the regular army had failed to do. Others saw it as an act of madness, Hitler's symbolic gesture of defiance against the inevitable, a suicidal bid to prove that the Reich would never surrender quietly. Perhaps it was both. Whatever his reasoning, the result was the same: tens of thousands dead, no strategic gain, and the complete destruction of Germany's last fighting strength. The survivors of the SS divisions fled westward into Austria, hoping to surrender to the Americans rather than face Soviet retribution. Many succeeded, but for others, capture meant death or imprisonment in the gulags. The legend of their doomed death ride endured, romanticized by some as a tale of loyalty and courage, but remembered by history as the final echo of a regime built on fanaticism and lies. When the guns fell silent, Hungary was left in ruin. The fields around Lake Balaton were littered with the twisted wrecks of panthers, the shattered husks of half-tracks, and the unburied bodies of men and horses. For the Hungarian civilians caught in between, the battle had brought only suffering. Villages were flattened by artillery fire, homes destroyed by Soviet barrages or blown apart by German demolition teams desperate to slow the advance. Thousands fled across the countryside, carrying what few possessions they could. The once fertile plains of Transdanubia were reduced to a wasteland of craters, rusting machines, and rotting corpses. When the spring thaw returned, the flooded fields revealed a grotesque harvest, bodies floating in the water, silent witnesses to a war that had devoured everything. For the Red Army, Operation Spring Awakening was the final proof that the enemy was finished. In his after-action report, Marshal Tolbuchin wrote with chilling simplicity, "The enemy has thrown in his last reserves. They are destroyed." Within weeks, Soviet troops stood not just at the gates of Vienna, but on the road to Berlin itself. The end of the war in Europe was no longer a matter of if, but when. For Sepp Dietrich and his commanders, there would be no redemption. The once feared 6th SS Panzer Army was encircled and captured in Austria that May. Many of its officers were tried for war crimes, and the already tainted reputation of the Waffen-SS was forever blackened. Operation Spring Awakening, conceived as a showcase of Hitler's elite, a final testament to their supposed purity and strength, had become their grave instead. When the fighting ended, the villages and roads of western Hungary fell silent. For years, the rusting carcasses of tanks lay scattered across the fields where they had died. Farmers plowed around the burned-out hulks of Panthers and T-34s, grim reminders of a conflict that had consumed an entire generation. The last offensive of the Third Reich had achieved nothing but devastation, a tragic epilogue to a regime built on delusion, violence, and death. By the time April turned to May, Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and the Reich had ceased to exist. Yet in the mud of Hungary, the traces of that final battle lingered, frozen beneath the earth, buried under ruins, and etched forever in the memories of those who survived. Operation Spring Awakening had been the dying roar of a collapsing empire, fierce, futile, and self-destructive to the very end. It was, in every sense, the death ride of the SS. Operation Spring Awakening stands as a haunting reminder of how blind loyalty and delusion can destroy even the most formidable armies. In the muddy fields of Hungary, the once proud Waffen-SS met its end not in glory, but in exhaustion and despair. The final roar of the Third Reich faded into silence, leaving behind only wreckage, graves, and the ghost of an empire that had consumed itself. If you were captivated by the story of desperation and downfall, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the hidden and forgotten battles of World War II. Share your thoughts below. Was Operation Spring Awakening an act of loyalty, or the final madness of a doomed empire?